Our language can be prison walls or bridges connecting people. This statement is not just a simple reminder of the power of words. It's a warning that we often forget language is not innocent. Every word uttered can sow the seeds of life or be the origin of division. In many civilizations, wars have erupted not solely because of weapons, but from discourses that breed hatred. Similarly, in personal life, the deepest wounds sometimes come not from a physical blow, but from a carelessly spoken word. This book emerges as a powerful counterargument against language often considered natural, yet laden with violence. The work presents a different approach, a communication structure that is both simple and revolutionary. It involves observing without judgment, identifying feelings, recognizing needs, and expressing them through clear requests. What's surprising is that these principles are not mere theories. They have been tested and proven in the harshest circumstances, from fractured families and conflict-ridden classrooms to political peace talks. However, the greatest value of this book doesn't lie in providing another soft skill. It forces the reader to question whether the entire foundation of communication we grew up with is built on degradation. Are we using language not to connect with people, but to manipulate, judge, and control? And if language can shape the very fabric of society, does changing it also mean changing how people coexist? This question, seemingly abstract, is intimately linked to our daily lives. Because the moment we choose to judge instead of listen, we initiate a silent chain of violence. And in the moment we dare to name our fears, our sorrows, our needs with honesty, we offer others the chance to recognize us as complete human beings. So, if every conversation from talking to a child at home, a colleague at work, to an adversary on the battlefield were to begin with compassionate listening, how much would the face of this world change? And do we have the courage to try stepping into a different language, the language of life, starting today? I was born into a world where the cries from the heart were often suffocated by the noise of violence, prejudice, and fear. But deep down, humans possess the ability to give from the heart. This ability is obscured, but it has never vanished throughout my life. I am haunted by two questions: what causes us to drift away from compassion? And conversely, why do some people retain their humanity in the harshest circumstances? In the summer of 1943, when my family moved to Detroit, these questions first became starkly clear. The city erupted in ethnic violence, dozens died. We were confined to our small house for 3 days, hearing every scream, every hurried footstep outside. And then, soon after, I learned that not only skin color but a name could also become a verdict. When the teacher called roll, a few students turned to look at me, uttering words I had never heard before. Later that afternoon, they waited for me outside the school gate, kicked me down, and trampled me. Those kicks not only hurt my body, but also opened a chasm in my mind. Why do people so easily turn words into weapons? Later, I read about Etty Hillesum, a young woman imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp. Amidst the darkness of that death camp, she still wrote in her diary about her ability to maintain compassion. Even when facing brutal Gestapo soldiers, she saw in them not just oppressors, but human beings carrying the wounds of their childhood. From that, I realized there was still a way to keep my heart from turning to stone, even when the world around me was filled with hatred. I began observing language, how people speak and listen, and saw that words could connect or divide. We think we're just communicating normally, but often it's those unintentional words that cause pain. From this, I found a principle. When the violence in the heart subsides, what remains is compassion. And to awaken it, we need a different way of speaking, a different way of listening. I call this nonviolent communication, not a new invention, but a rediscovery of what humans inherently know but have forgotten. It teaches us to observe without judgment, name our true feelings, recognize our underlying needs, and make specific requests instead of demands. These 4 components create the flow of connection. Imagine a mother speaking to her child. Felix, when I see 5 dirty socks strewn across the living room, I feel annoyed because I need tidiness in our shared space. Would you be willing to put them in your room or the washing machine? In this way of speaking, there is no accusation, no labeling, only observation, feelings, needs, and a clear request. That is the difference between judgment and a bridge to connection. As I practiced, I realized language changes how we see the world. I no longer reacted with anger or withdrawal. I began to listen precisely to what I and others truly needed. This isn't just a tool, it's a training in awareness. Instead of shining the light of consciousness where there are no answers, we shine it where life can be found. I remember a drunk man kneeling under a streetlight, fumbling for his keys. A police officer asked, "What are you doing?" He replied, "Looking for my keys." "Did you drop them here?" "No, over in that dark alley, but it's brighter here." We are often the same, looking for solutions in familiar, bright places of judgment, accusation, and comparison instead of daring to shine a light into the dark areas where our true needs reside. Nonviolent communication taught me to courageously abandon that false light and step into the darkness to find the key that unlocks compassion. As I began to live this way, I saw it applied everywhere. In families, schools, hospitals, workplaces, and even international negotiation tables. A woman on the verge of divorce used this method to hear the pain hidden behind her husband's accusations. A special education teacher used it to help a violent child name his anger instead of lashing out. A doctor in Paris used it to care for terminally ill patients, not with medicine, but with a compassionate presence. I brought this method to Jerusalem, where Israelis and Palestinians were engulfed in hatred. In one workshop, an Israeli woman, who once believed that occupying land was a religious commandment, burst into tears after being listened to with empathy. She said, "I could leave this land if they could listen to me like that." That moment showed me that when people are understood, the iron wall in their hearts can melt away. Nonviolent communication doesn't require the other person to know the technique. If just one side maintains the will to give and receive with compassion, resonance will eventually occur. It doesn't always come quickly, but it surely comes. And when it appears, no one wins or loses. There is only the joy of seeing each other as human beings. As I delved deeper into the life of language, I realized there are ways of speaking that block compassion at its very roots. These communication patterns are so common that we consider them normal, but in reality, they sow the seeds of alienation, suffering, and violence. One of the most common types is moralistic judgment. Every time we label, "You're so selfish," "She's lazy," "They're stupid," we push the other person outside the circle of humanity. Instead of expressing our own needs and feelings, we choose the quick path of categorizing others as right or wrong. But in that moment, we lose the ability to connect. Judgment becomes a blade that causes the other person to either defend or attack. And if they do comply, their motivation isn't love, but fear, guilt, or shame. That price, sooner or later, both sides must pay. Sometimes we don't use direct judgment but fall into the trap of comparison. Comparisons that seem harmless gnaw at the soul. "Look how much better your classmate is at school. Why can't you be like your older brother?" Or even with ourselves, "Mozart composed music at 12 and I'm still nothing." Comparison turns us into losers in an endless game. And when we torment ourselves, it's difficult to open our hearts with compassion to others. Another, more subtle form is the denial of responsibility. We often say, "I have to do it. They made me. You made me angry." These phrases seem harmless, but they actually conceal the truth. We always have choices, and our feelings stem from our own needs. When we say, "I have to," we lose our freedom and turn ourselves into instruments of some vague power rules, traditions, superiors, or even fate. This very language has allowed countless historical tragedies to occur. Executioners reassured themselves with, "I was just following orders." Another door leading to separation is the language of demands. When we phrase our desires as commands, always accompanied by the shadow of punishment or blame, we close the door to dialogue. Children taught me this lesson most clearly. I could order them all day, but I couldn't make them do things willingly. At most, I could make them fearful or foster covert resistance. And whenever I chose the path of punishment, they found ways to make me regret it. The lesson here is clear. We cannot make anyone do anything. We can only help them see the value in it. Hidden behind all these language patterns is an ancient ideology that believes humans are inherently bad and need to be controlled through rewards and punishments. Societies built on violence have instilled this poison into language. When we repeatedly use words like should, must, deserves to be, we unwittingly perpetuate a culture of slavery where people no longer know their true needs. But notice a paradox. It's precisely when we stop blaming and comparing that we can look directly at our own vulnerability. We see that behind every anger, every judgment, there are only unmet needs. Instead of "you're selfish," It might be, I'm sad because I need consideration. Instead of she's lazy, it might be, I'm worried because I need cooperation. And when we dare to express ourselves this way, another door opens a door leading to compassion. This isn't easy. Our entire culture has trained us in the opposite direction. Children grow up with the language of who deserves what, who is bad, who needs to be punished. Movies, media, and politics all reinforce these habits. But precisely because of this, practicing a different way of speaking becomes even more urgent. It not only changes personal relationships, but can also soothe collective conflicts. The first step of nonviolent communication, therefore, is an awareness of the language that blocks compassion. We cannot change until we recognize that we are breathing toxic air. And once we recognize it, we can choose to inhale a new, fresher air for ourselves and for others, to move further along the path of connecting from the heart. To move further on the path of connecting from the heart, we need to learn a skill that seems simple but is profoundly difficult: observing without judging. In daily life, we often confuse describing an event with attaching a label to it. We say, "You're irresponsible," when the work isn't done, instead of, "I see the report hasn't been completed by the deadline." We say, "She's arrogant," instead of, "In the meeting, I heard her speak loudly and not let others contribute." This small confusion can completely erase the possibility of connection, because when we mix observation with evaluation, others no longer hear reality. They only hear accusation. Distinguishing between describing an event and attaching a label is the foundation of nonviolent communication. This doesn't mean we have to become emotionless cameras, merely recording scenes. We still have feelings, we still have evaluations. But we need to separate these two things. When speaking about reality, let reality speak. When sharing feelings, name the feelings accurately. This clarity creates space for dialogue. In one workshop, I was introduced to an audience with the phrase, "the most arrogant speaker we've ever had." The remark made the audience laugh, but it simultaneously created an invisible barrier. From the outset, I was framed in a certain image, and everything I said afterward was filtered through that frame. If instead, the introducer had simply said, "He spent 30 minutes in a previous lecture talking about his achievements," the audience could have formed their own perceptions. To practice, I often give examples. "You arrived late twice today" is an observation, but "you're so careless" is already an evaluation. Or, "I heard you talking while I was speaking" is an observation, while "you're so rude" is a judgment. The exercise seems simple, but when applied to life, we realize how difficult it is. Because from a young age, we've been taught to label, categorize, and judge, instead of simply seeing and stating what we truly observe. I remember once a young boy was scolded by his mother, "You're so lazy." When I asked his mother what she meant, she said, "I saw he hadn't done his homework and he was lying watching TV for an hour." So it was clear, she wasn't observing, she was accusing. And the boy heard only one message: "Mom doesn't love me." The truth was simple. She saw an action. If she had stated just that, the boy might have understood his mother's concern. But by turning it into a condemnation, compassion on both sides was blocked. The paradox is, the more we label, the more we lose the ability to see what's actually happening. Judgment makes us wear colored glasses, seeing only what we want to see. We label someone as lazy, and then all their subsequent actions are interpreted in a way that reinforces that label. But when we take off the glasses, we see clearly. Sometimes they are just tired or have other unmet needs. When we practice observation without evaluation, a strange change occurs. The other person begins to open up instead of defending. They can listen instead of reacting. They can share. This requires patience, but the reward is a true connection. I often tell students to try starting with small things. Instead of "It's terribly hot," say, "The temperature today is 35 degrees Celsius." Instead of "You never listen to me," try, "I've shared 3 times, but I haven't heard a response from you." These small details are the foundation for building the edifice of compassion. Observing without judgment is not about suppressing feelings. On the contrary, it opens an opportunity for feelings to be expressed correctly. Because when an event is stated clearly, we can follow with "and I feel." At that point, the message becomes transparent. We are no longer attacking, we are simply sharing our true experience. Gradually, I saw that this skill not only salvaged tense conversations, but also changed how I saw myself. I learned to say, "I've written half the draft," instead of "I'm so incompetent." I learned to observe effort instead of labeling it as failure. And in that change, self-compassion began to grow. After learning to observe events without turning them into condemnations, the next step is to confront the most often hidden part of communication: identifying and expressing feelings. We grow up in homes, schools, and societies that teach that expressing emotions is a sign of weakness or trouble. How many times have you heard, "Men don't cry," "Being angry is bad," "Don't show weakness"? These very words created a high price, the price of buried emotions. When we are not allowed to say, "I'm sad," "I'm lonely," "I'm scared," those feelings don't disappear. They silently transform into alienation, into outbursts of anger, into violence turned towards others or ourselves. The problem isn't just a lack of language. Many people can't even distinguish between a true feeling and a disguised judgment. When someone says, "I feel betrayed," or "I feel like a failure," they are actually making an evaluation rather than describing a feeling. Betrayed or failure both imply the behavior of others or a label attached to oneself. True feelings are much simpler. I feel sad. I feel disappointed. I feel helpless. Building a vocabulary for emotions is indispensable. In my trainings, I often give students a list of feeling words, from joy, peace, and hope to anger, anxiety, and shame. Only when we can name them accurately can we truly understand and express ourselves. I remember once a man sitting silently after class confessed that his whole life he only knew two words: good and bad. When he started reading the list, he suddenly wept because for the first time he realized, oh, I can say I feel lost, I feel confused, I feel hopeful. The exercise of expressing feelings is simple but challenging. Write down a recent situation and then record the true feelings you experienced, using only words that describe internal states without judgment. For example, yesterday, when you didn't reply to my message, I felt anxious and sad. That's a completely different message from, "You're so inconsiderate." There's a story I'll always remember. A woman in a workshop shared that she constantly argued with her teenage son. When I asked her, she said, "I feel he doesn't respect me." I suggested she try to rephrase it, stating only her feelings. She was silent for a moment, then whispered, "I feel heartbroken because I need to be heard." In that instant, her eyes changed from fury to softness. When she brought this way of speaking home, her son, instead of yelling, sat down for the first time and asked, "Mom, what can I do so you feel heard?" Just a small change in naming feelings opened a new door. Feelings are not enemies, they are maps pointing to unmet needs. If we listen, feelings guide us to the deepest part of our hearts, where true needs reside. Anger often conceals a need for respect. Fear often signals a need for safety. Sadness is often connected to a desire for connection. When we dare to express our feelings, we are giving others the opportunity to see those very needs, instead of just the rough exterior of our behavior. I once worked with a prisoner who had been incarcerated for 30 years for murder. He said that the most dangerous enemy in his life was not his opponents outside, but his own pent-up anger. He didn't know how to name and express it, and one day it exploded into an irredeemable act. In prison, when he learned to distinguish true feelings, he understood. If only on that day I could have said, "I am desperate and need help," my life would have been different. Therefore, expressing feelings is not weakness but courage. It requires honesty, because we must shed the facade of "I'm fine, it's okay," to express what is truly flowing in our hearts. It requires trust that when we confide, the other person will listen instead of taking advantage. And above all, it requires self-respect to know that our feelings are valuable, worthy of respect like any truth. When communities begin to learn how to share feelings, something miraculous happens. Instead of meetings full of criticism, we have dialogues where each person can say, "I feel anxious," "I feel stressed," "I feel excited." Instead of battlefields in families, we have conversations where parents and children admit, "Mom is sad," "I feel lonely." In that space, people meet at the deepest level, the level of the heart. Having learned to name and express feelings, the next question is, who is responsible for those feelings? This is a crucial turning point because many people are accustomed to thinking that their feelings are caused by others. "You make me furious." "She makes me miserable." "They make me disappointed." This language is so familiar that we don't realize it has deprived us of our own freedom. In reality, our feelings stem from our own needs, not from the actions of others. The other person may be the stimulus, but never the cause. Anger, sadness, happiness, or anxiety are all mirrors reflecting needs that are either met or unmet. When we externalize responsibility, we become helpless victims. When we reclaim it, we can find a path to connection. I often point out that when we hear a negative message, we have 4 choices. 1. Blame ourselves. Someone says, "You're selfish," and we immediately believe it and tell ourselves, "Yes, I am terrible." 2. Blame the other person. We retaliate, "No, you're the selfish one." 3. Recognize our own feelings and needs. We might say, "I hear that, and I feel hurt because I need respect." 4. Listen to the other person's feelings and needs. We try to guess, "Are you saying that because you need more consideration?" Of these 4 paths, only the latter 2 open up the possibility of connection. A memorable example is the story about some people demanding the reinstatement of discrimination against children born out of wedlock. When confronted with such a harsh viewpoint, the initial reaction might be anger and condemnation. But if we look deeper, we see that behind that call is anxiety, an insecurity about tottering social values. If we can listen to that fear and simultaneously be honest with our own feelings, the dialogue will be completely different. The difference between the pain of expressing needs and the pain of suppressing needs is also worth pondering. It's true that when we admit, "I need affection," we are vulnerable, easily exposed to rejection. But if we choose silence, the price is even heavier. The need remains, silently gnawing from within, turning into bitterness and resentment. Better to endure the honest pain of expression than the prolonged pain of suppression. In this journey, many people go through 3 stages, which I call from emotional slavery to emotional liberation. In the first stage, we believe we are responsible for others' feelings. Someone is angry and we feel guilty. In the second stage, we shake it off. "I'm not responsible for anyone. Let them be sad or happy." But by the third stage, maturity arrives. We realize we are responsible for our own feelings, and we can choose how to respond in a way that is both honest and respectful of the other person's needs. I once worked with a man who constantly tormented his wife because she couldn't bear children. He was bitterly angry despite her suffering. In one session, I asked if he could clearly state his feelings. He yelled, "I feel ashamed. I need acceptance." Only when he dared to admit that need did he break free from the cycle of blaming his wife. For the first time in years, his wife wept because she finally heard her husband's true feelings, not just accusations. The exercise of identifying needs often starts with small situations. Write down a time you felt angry, then ask, "What unmet need is this feeling connected to?" It could be a need for safety, a need for respect, a need for acknowledgement. Once recognized, we can express it clearly, no longer beating around the bush with accusations. Taking responsibility for feelings doesn't mean blaming ourselves. On the contrary, it gives us back our freedom. Instead of letting emotions be controlled by external words or actions, we become the navigator. And when we can navigate ourselves, we can truly connect with others. It's precisely when we stop blaming others for our feelings that the other person becomes more willing to listen. Because when they hear, "You make me miserable," they immediately erect a defensive wall. But when they hear, "I feel sad because I need consideration," they see a human being, not an indictment. And people are more moved by genuine vulnerability than by condemnation. Having learned to observe, name feelings, and take responsibility for ourselves, we still lack one missing link to complete the circle: making life-nurturing requests. Most of us are accustomed to turning needs into demands. "Do it now." "Stop arguing." "Be quiet, please." Implicit in these are threats. If you don't comply, you'll be punished, blamed, or affection will be withdrawn. But requests are different from demands. A request is an open door, while a demand is a blocking wall. When making a request, we allow the other person the right to choose. When making a demand, we coerce through fear or guilt. For a request to truly foster connection, it needs to be clear, specific, positive, and doable. Instead of, "I want you to be more caring," we can say, "Would you be willing to spend 15 minutes tonight listening to me talk about my day?" Instead of, "You need to study harder," we try, "Would you be willing to do your math homework for 20 minutes before watching TV?" This language aims not to coerce, but to invite cooperation. I remember once a mother told her son, "You never help me with chores." The boy immediately shot back, "Yes, I do." the conversation turned into a yes-no battle. But if she had said, "I'm sad because I haven't seen you wash the dishes as you promised. Would you be willing to do them now?" The boy would hear a specific request, leaving no room for equivocation. Positive action language is also very important. Imagine saying, "Don't be inconsiderate anymore." The listener would be confused, not knowing what to do to not be inconsiderate. But if you say, "Could you call me when you leave work so I know you're safe?" That's a specific, actionable request. Of course, requests are not always met. But even when rejected, honesty and clarity maintain the connection. Because instead of blaming, we simply show the other person what we desire, and that can open up dialogue. If not this way, is there another way? Parallel to making requests, we need an equally important skill: empathetic listening. Often, simply being silently present and truly listening gives the other person the greatest gift. Empathetic listening is not about finding immediate solutions, much less about judging or lecturing. It is simply about letting the other person know that their voice has touched a heart. There's a story that haunts me. A woman recounted that her husband was dying, but before he passed, he wanted her to hear what he had to say. She couldn't bear the pain, she kept interrupting, "Don't say that, you'll be fine." But eventually, she held his hand and just listened. He whispered, "Thank you, my dear. Now I am at peace." It was that presence and empathy that gave him the strength to pass away peacefully. The art of reflecting feelings and needs is also part of listening. When someone says, "I can't take it anymore," we can respond, "Are you feeling overwhelmed and needing rest?" Sometimes, just one sentence like that makes the other person burst into tears because finally, someone understands them. We don't need to agree, we just need to understand. The biggest challenge of empathetic listening is when we ourselves are in pain. At that moment, we want to scream our own suffering more than open our hearts to others. But the paradox is that if we put our own pain aside for a moment and listen, often we ourselves are healed. Because in the process of offering empathy, we clearly see that the person on the other side is vulnerable and hurting, strangely just like us. Once in a workshop between Israelis and Palestinians, an Israeli man vented his anger. "You people just want to kill us." Immediately, the room grew tense. I asked everyone to be silent and listen. When he was reflected back that he was feeling scared and needed safety, his face softened. Then, a Palestinian woman burst into tears. "We also just want to be safe." In that moment, the enemies looked at each other and saw that they shared a common need. When we listen with empathy, we reach a deep level where people are no longer this side or that side, but simply hearts seeking life. Throughout years of accompanying others, I've seen one thing clearly: empathy is a healing power. When a person is truly listened to, the seemingly unbearable pain subsides. A prisoner once confessed to me that for 20 years, no one had truly listened to him. When I just listened, without judging, without interrupting, he wept like a child. It wasn't because I offered solutions, but simply because he was finally acknowledged. Empathy doesn't demand that we agree, nor does it require us to give advice. It only asks us to be present, to open our hearts to feel with the other person. That very presence creates a safe space where fears, anger, and humiliation can be released. In that quiet room, sometimes the only thing I did was nod or repeat a few words, and the other person continued to pour out their heart. At times, I felt like I was just a vessel for them to unload their burdens. When the vessel lightened, they found their next step on their own. What many people don't realize is that vulnerability is strength. Society teaches us to appear strong, to hide weakness. But when I dared to say, "I feel scared, I feel lonely," a strange thing happened. The other person opened up more. That vulnerability didn't make me small, it made me genuinely close. And that very authenticity nurtures trust. In a community gathering, I once admitted my own insecurity before leading the group. Instead of losing credibility, I saw the whole group begin to share more honestly. It turns out that courage doesn't lie in hiding, but in daring to expose oneself. There are life-or-death situations where using empathy to de-escalate danger becomes the only way out. Once, in a prison, an inmate rushed into the room with a knife, yelling. Everyone's first instinct was to fight back or flee. I chose to stand still and said, "You're very angry. Is it because you feel abandoned?" Suddenly, his arm trembled and the knife fell to the floor. What he needed was not to be subdued, but for someone to see the burning pain within him. Sometimes empathy is challenged by rejections. Hearing a no without severing the relationship is an art. A friend told me, "I can't help you right now." Instead of feeling betrayed, I listened to the need behind that refusal. Perhaps he was tired, needed rest. Perhaps he was worried about his family. When I said, "You need more time to take care of your personal matters, right?" his eyes softened. The no was no longer a slammed door, but another door opening to understanding. Empathy also has the ability to revive stale conversations. I remember a married couple who had lived together for years in almost complete silence. Every time one spoke, the other would either defend or mock. When I invited them to practice listening, at first there was only tense silence. But when the husband awkwardly tried to reflect his wife's feelings, "You feel neglected, don't you?" Her eyes welled up with tears, and she nodded. Just one simple sentence. The dry conversation suddenly regained vitality. Sometimes even silence is full of cries. Empathizing with silence requires subtlety. A student sat motionless in a workshop, not saying a word. Instead of forcing her to speak, I simply breathed and sat beside her. A few minutes later, she burst into tears. "I thought no one cared about me anymore." It turned out her silence was a suppressed cry. Only when we are patient enough to listen with our heart does silence reveal its true content. We think we help others by giving advice, but often that very thing distances them. They need empathy before they are ready for change. Like barren land, if you sow seeds immediately, they will die. Only when the soil is moistened by empathy will the seeds of solutions sprout. After touching the power of empathy with others, I realized an undeniable truth. If we don't know how to turn inward, all connections are half-hearted. Therefore, the next step is to connect compassionately with ourselves. The first thing I learned was to remember and nurture my own unique qualities amidst life's currents. It's easy to forget our individual worth, allowing comparisons and judgments to cover it with dust. Many people only see flaws and fail to recognize the talent, creativity, patience, or tenderness they possess. In my workshops, I often invite students to write down 3 qualities they cherish in themselves. At first, most are awkward, even crying from a sense of emptiness. But when they dare to write down, "I am persistent," "I have compassion for others," the light returns to their eyes. When we make mistakes or fail, the familiar tendency is to self-torment. But what we need is to self-assess within our imperfection, without denial, without judgment. A woman once told me, "I'm terrible. I yelled at my child when he just spilled milk." I guided her to see it differently. You feel that you acted differently from your value of love. So you could say, "I'm sad because I need patience." That's not judgment, but an acknowledgement of an unmet need. With just that small shift, she was no longer drowned in guilt, but could learn from the experience. Within us, there often exists a harsh voice that sows self-judgments and internal commands. "You must do better. You're never good enough." If we translate that voice into the language of needs, it suddenly softens. Instead of "You're useless," we might hear, "I need to feel recognized to achieve." Instead of "You're lazy," it's "I need rest." This translation transforms the inner jailer into a companion. A concept I call mourning in NVC is also very important when looking back at what we haven't achieved. Instead of agonizing, we mourn, "I'm sad because I couldn't express care as I wished." Mourning is not self-torment, but a way to honor unmet needs so they can guide us. From there, we can move forward with clarity instead of being weighed down by regret. I remember a story about self-forgiveness. A father recounted that he had abandoned his daughter for many years. In a workshop, he broke down crying, "I'm a terrible person." I invited him to listen to himself. "You're in pain because you need closeness with your daughter, right?" He nodded. For the first time, he forgave himself not by erasing his guilt, but by acknowledging his true need, the need for connection. Forgiveness is not forgetting mistakes, but returning to needs to open a new path. One principle completely changed how I live: don't do anything unless it's play. This means acting from joy, from willingness, not from the pressure of "have to." When we do something with a sense of being forced, that energy will haunt the outcome. But when we act with a spirit of play, we bring creativity and lightness. A teacher who applied this principle said, "When I graded papers with the mindset, 'I have to grade,' I felt irritable. But when I saw it as a game of discovering my students' intelligence, I became interested." This leads to a deeper transformation, shifting from "have to" choose to. Every time we hear in our heads, "I have to do this," try changing it to, "I choose to do this because I want to." For instance, I have to go to work becomes, I choose to go to work because I want to support my family and maintain my life. The words change, and the feeling changes too from heavy to self-reliant. When we cultivate awareness of the motivation behind each action, we clearly see our freedom. I am no longer a victim of duty or obligation, but someone making choices. And when I recognize that motivation, I can adjust. If I act only out of fear of punishment, I will be exhausted. If I act out of joy and care, I will be re-energized. All of this leads to one conclusion. To offer compassion to others, we first need to know how to offer compassion to ourselves. Because if we are full of judgment and coercion internally, what we send out will carry that same color. But when we learn to listen to needs, forgive, and act from joy, we become a living testament that compassion is not a slogan, but a way of life every day. After learning to connect with myself through compassion, I had to confront a force often considered dangerous: anger. For a long time, society has labeled anger as negative, seeing it as an enemy to be suppressed or unleashed. But in my experience, anger is not an enemy, it's a signal. It's like an alarm bell, reminding us that an unmet need is crying out. The first thing to understand is the distinction between stimulus and cause. When someone says something offensive, that behavior is only the stimulus. The root cause of anger is a deep, unmet need within us, the need for respect, safety, understanding. Many people think, "He made me furious." But the truth is we become angry because we haven't learned how to connect with our own needs. If we only target the stimulus, we attack the other person. If we look at the cause, we find an opportunity to connect. I remember a student who recounted yelling at his colleague, "You're so irresponsible." As we dissected the situation together, he realized that hidden beneath that anger was a worry. "I need cooperation to complete the project on time." When he dared to express that instead of judging, the conversation completely changed. His colleague was no longer defensive, but ready to discuss how to collaborate. That is living proof that all anger conceals an unmet need. To transform anger, I propose a 4-step process for expressing it. 1. Stop and breathe. Anger often urges us to react immediately. Just one deep breath creates a distance between the stimulus and the reaction. 2. Recognize judgmental thoughts. He's wrong, I'm useless, they deserve to be punished. Name them, but don't let them lead you. 3. Connect with the unmet need. Respect, trust, understanding, safety, or connection. 4. Express feelings and needs honestly. I feel anxious because I need clarity. Could you clarify your plan? When we go through these 4 steps, anger becomes a bridge instead of a weapon. Another important principle is to offer empathy before expressing anger. Often, the other person is also angry. If we vent our anger immediately, 2 streams of fire meeting will only burn hotter. But if we listen, "Are you angry because you need respect?" the fire can subside. Only when the other person is heard are they ready to hear us. That is not submissiveness. It's the strategy of compassion, prioritizing connection over winning or losing. Of course, this requires allowing time. There are times when we can't say anything immediately when we're too angry. I choose to remain silent and revisit it later. I don't see that as avoidance, but as protecting the connection, because words uttered in anger are often like arrows. Once flown, they don't return. But when I return after an hour or a day, with a calmer heart, I can say what needs to be said without damaging the relationship. There's a story I'll never forget. A teenager in my class hit a friend because he was being teased. When I asked him what he felt inside before hitting, he hesitated. I felt humiliated because I needed to be respected. When he spoke those words, the whole class fell silent. The other children, instead of mocking, looked at him with understanding. And from that day on, the number of fights significantly decreased, because when they knew how to express their needs, they no longer needed their fists. Anger, when expressed completely, becomes a door to life. It is no longer a deep chasm of separation, but an invitation to return to true needs. And when we learn how to transform anger into a message, we not only salvage relationships, but also free ourselves from the chains of blind reaction. When people learn to listen to feelings and needs, even in anger, we enter a more challenging domain: conflict resolution and reconciliation. There, not just 2 individuals, but sometimes entire communities and nations are caught in a spiral of hurt. What I learned is to prioritize human connection over winning or losing. In many traditional mediation models, the goal is to reach an agreement as quickly as possible or find a middle ground. But by focusing too early on solutions, we miss a crucial opportunity to see each other as human beings. An agreement can be signed, but the deep chasm in the heart remains. My approach is different. First, we must create a space for both sides to be heard and acknowledged. When connection forms, solutions often emerge naturally. I remember a mediation between two groups of students who were constantly fighting. When asked why, they offered all sorts of reasons. They looked down on us. We have to get revenge. If I had tried to impose rules, they would probably have nodded outwardly and then gone back to their old ways. Instead, I invited each student to express their feelings and needs. One boy said, "I'm angry because I need respect," and another confessed, "I feel scared because I need a sense of safety." When those words resonated, the students no longer saw each other as enemies, but as people sharing the same pain. It was that shift that ended the fighting, not because of a prohibition, but because of understanding. The key steps in NVC mediation are often as follows. First, listen to each side, reflecting their feelings and needs. Next, help them recognize common ground: both need safety, respect, and peace. Then, distinguish between needs and strategies. Needs are universal, strategies differ. One person might want to occupy land, the other to keep it. But the common need might be safety, a sense of belonging. When they realize they are not opposing each other on needs, but only disagreeing on how to achieve them, the door for negotiation opens. Another important principle is to use present, positive action language. Instead of, "I don't want you to neglect me anymore," we can say, "I want you to spend 10 minutes talking with me each day." Positive language helps the other person clearly visualize what they can do instead of being left in an ambiguous zone. And then, when faced with a refusal, we practice translating no. No isn't necessarily a slammed door. Often, it's just another way to express a need. If someone says, "No, I don't agree," we can ask, "Is it because you need more time? Or is it because you want to ensure your needs are also respected?" Translating no into a need is a way to turn a wall into a mirror, reflecting what the other side truly yearns for. The role of the mediator is to keep that space safe. Sometimes just a glance, a misplaced interjection, can ignite conflict. The mediator needs enough patience to listen to each side, enough courage to gently remind them when they fall back into accusations, and most importantly, the mediator must believe in the compassion of both sides, even when they have lost faith in each other. Sometimes one or both parties refuse to meet. In such cases, informal mediation can still occur. I once sat privately with each person, listening to their needs, and then relayed them to the other side using compassionate language. Gradually, as they felt understood, they dared to open up. Sometimes, just that initial step is enough to reduce tension. I also found that informal mediation in everyday life is just as powerful. A mother heard her daughter accuse, "Mom, you're always busy." Instead of reacting with, "You're so ungrateful," she tried to say, "Are you feeling sad and wanting me to spend more time with you?" And in that moment, the conflict dissolved. Mediation doesn't have to happen at a conference table. It happens in the kitchen, in the classroom, on the street, anywhere people meet. When we prioritize connection over solutions, conflict is no longer a battle, but an opportunity to build a new world in a world full of tension. In a world full of tension, sometimes we cannot avoid using force, but here we need to clearly distinguish using force to protect, not to punish. This seems minor, but it is actually the decisive boundary between compassion and violence. When is force unavoidable? It is when a person's safety is directly threatened. A child running into the street, we grab their hand and pull them back. A patient in a psychotic episode, we restrain them so they don't harm themselves. These actions stem from the need to protect life, not to make anyone pay a price. The difference lies in the mindset behind the use of force. When we punish, we believe that people only change by enduring pain or fear. When we protect, we believe that their fundamental nature is to yearn for life, and sometimes they act dangerously because their needs are unrecognized. In that context, what we do is keep them and others safe, and then seek to connect with their needs. I have seen too many lives crushed by common forms of punishment. A child spanked for a wrong answer on homework. A student named and shamed in class for not knowing a lesson. a husband whose wife withdraws affection to teach him a lesson. All of these do not lead to lasting change, but only sow fear, resentment, or covert resistance. The danger is that punishment seems effective in the short term. The child might stop acting out, the worker might obey commands, but in the long run, the price of punishment is the loss of trust, joy, and intrinsic motivation. Instead of learning to act out of willingness, people only learn how to avoid pain and humiliation. That is the foundation of a society of fear, not of compassion. I often pose two questions that expose the limits of punishment. 1. Does the other person change because they truly understand the value of the action or merely out of fear of repercussions? 2. Does the relationship afterward become stronger or more fractured? The answer almost always shows that punishment builds nothing lasting. In an educational environment, this is very clear. Its application in schools is the clearest test. One teacher recounted that he used to punish students by giving low grades or making them stand in a corner. The result was that the children only studied to avoid bad grades and grew to hate learning even more. After practicing compassionate communication, he changed. When a student was making noise instead of scolding, "You are so undisciplined," he said. "I'm worried because I need quiet so the whole class can learn. Can you share with me what you need right now?" The miracle was that the student not only became quiet, but also began to cooperate. In another school, teachers completely abandoned punishment and switched to dialogue. A disruptive student was invited to sit down and talk about his feelings and needs. He admitted, "I'm sad because I feel abandoned at home." From that, the teachers understood and found ways to support him. Without punishment, the student gradually changed his behavior because he felt genuine care. The paradox is that when we abandon punishment, many people think we are being indulgent or lacking discipline, but the truth is we are choosing the harder path, the path of building discipline from within, based on understanding and willingness. It requires much more patience, but yields results many times more profound and lasting. Using force to protect is prioritizing life over revenge. It reminds us that every time we intend to punish someone, we should stop and ask, does this action nurture life, or does it only sow more fear? When we can answer that question, we know which direction we are headed. When the journey with others has reached its culmination, I return to the question, are we truly free internally? Many speak of freedom, but remain bound by invisible voices in their heads. Therefore, the final step is to liberate oneself and learn the art of gratitude. Liberation begins by dismantling old programming from childhood. We were surrounded by judgments. You're lazy. You'll never be accepted if you make mistakes. You must study well to be worthy of love. These words are etched so deeply that when we grow up, we still hear them echoing in our minds. Only when we learn to translate those judgments into needs can we escape. You're lazy becomes, I need to contribute. You're useless becomes, I need to feel valuable. In this way, the old shackles are dismantled piece by piece. Just like external conflicts, we often have inner conflicts. Therefore, an important part is resolving internal conflicts. Sometimes, a part of us wants to rest, while another part wants to work. If we only suppress, we will be exhausted. But when we listen to each part, acknowledging the needs of both, we can find a harmonious solution. That might be working for an hour, then resting for 10 minutes. The miracle is that when both needs are heard, the inner energy becomes clear, no longer fragmented. To achieve this, we need to nurture our internal environment instead of constantly self-diagnosing. I'm wrong. I'm broken. We shift to the language of needs. I'm sad because I need connection. I'm disappointed because I need recognition. From self-torment, we become our own compassionate companion, and only when we cherish our inner self can we truly offer compassion to others. I once met a woman who harbored resentment and self-judgment for many years. She blamed her husband, herself, and her whole life. When she learned to practice self-empathy, she began to write, "I'm angry because I need care. I'm ashamed because I need appreciation." Each line was like pulling a thorn from her heart. After several weeks, she sighed in relief. "For the first time, I feel peace in my heart." That is the power of replacing judgment with the language of needs. And finally, we touch a life-nurturing energy source, gratitude. In compassionate communication, often expressions of thanks turn into condescending praise. "You're so good. You're amazing." It can make the recipient confused, even suspicious. But when we learn to express gratitude in a compassionate spirit, it becomes a core light. The essence lies in the pure intention behind the thanks. We don't praise for the other person to do better, nor flatter to gain favor, but simply want to let them know that their actions have enriched our lives. This is expressed through 3 components of gratitude. 1. State the specific action the other person did. 2. Point out which of our needs was met by that action. 3. Share the true feeling that arose within us. For example, instead of saying, "You're wonderful," we can say, "When you listened to me all last night, I felt relieved and safe because I really needed someone to accompany me when I was vulnerable." This expression of gratitude not only makes the other person happy, but also helps them see the true meaning of their action. Another challenge is learning to receive gratitude. Many people are embarrassed, waving their hands dismissively. "Oh, it was nothing." But in doing so, we reject the gift the other person is offering. Try simply smiling and letting your heart receive it. That gratitude doesn't need to be reciprocated, it just needs to be acknowledged. Someone told me, "I'm hesitant to express appreciation. I'm afraid others might think I'm flattering." But overcoming that hesitation in expressing and receiving appreciation is the path to enriching both. Because gratitude is not weakness, but the courage to look directly at what nurtures life and to name it. I believe that when a community learns to express gratitude in this way, the atmosphere will change. Instead of suspicion, there will be trust. Instead of fierce competition, there will be support. And above all, each person will feel that their existence has meaning. Liberating oneself and practicing gratitude completes the journey of compassionate communication, from observation, feelings, needs, requests, to empathy. We return to ourselves, freed from the shackles of judgment, and when we learn to see the beauty, the life in every action, we not only live but also light the way for others. There are books that, when closed, don't just add to our knowledge but question us to our very core. The journey just described is a testament to this. It doesn't merely teach us how to choose words, but compels us to look directly at the truth. The world we live in is shaped by the language we choose. Wars, wounds, and even silent loneliness all begin with a word uttered in the wrong place, a lack of compassion in a glance, a need that was never named. The first lesson is that communication is not a tactic to get what we want, but a mirror reflecting our inner qualities. If our hearts are full of judgment, our words will become sharp knives. If our hearts hold compassion, every word will become a stream of water that quenches the thirst of others. Therefore, changing language is also changing ourselves. The second lesson is that feelings are not something to run away from. They are compasses pointing to our deepest needs. When we dare to say, "I'm sad because I need to be connected," we are not weak. We are more courageous than anyone who yells in anger. Because in that moment, we lay our vulnerability on the table and invite others to step in. That is an act of faith. The third lesson is that conflict has no winners or losers. It is a door to seeing commonality. When we are patient enough to hear a no and translate it into a need, we are transforming a wall into a bridge. And when communities that seemed unable to coexist, from fractured families to nations filled with hatred, find a common voice in their needs, history can suddenly take a different turn. The final lesson is that gratitude is not just courtesy, but how we nurture life. When we point out a specific action that met a need and created a feeling, we are not just saying thanks. We are honoring the life flow that connects us all. And in a world where people are easily swallowed by the machinery, genuine gratitude can become the most powerful resistance. Now, the question for you is not whether you have understood all the theory, but which way of speaking you will choose in your next conversation. When someone disappoints you, will you utter the familiar accusation? Or will you try to pause, name your feelings, recognize your needs, and make a clear request? Do you dare to try listening to a no and find out what need is speaking within it? Do you dare to sit with yourself, transform your self-judgments into true needs, and from there, forgive and liberate yourself? And deeper still, are you willing to try to believe that people, even those who anger you most, are only trying to meet needs similar to your own? If the answer is yes, the world you see will change color. If the answer is no, then at least you know where you stand on this journey. I am not asking you to become someone else overnight. I am only inviting you to try, just once in one conversation, to apply a small step, Observe instead of judge, name feelings instead of hide them, acknowledge needs instead of accuse, make requests instead of demand. You will see that the difference doesn't lie in the other person, but begins with you. Let this journey not stop on the pages of a book. Bring it to the dining table, into the classroom, into the workplace, into every relationship. And when you experience a moment of true connection, eyes soften, hearts open, you will understand that all we sought from the beginning was to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged as human beings. I want you to ask yourself a question. If every conversation began from the heart, instead of from judgment, how would your life be different? And if you find this journey meaningful, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you think is also longing to be heard. Try practicing together. Let a small community begin to change, and then let those ripples spread. Because ultimately, changing the world is not the work of powerful politicians. It begins with a different way of speaking, a different way of seeing in the most ordinary moments of life. And you, right now, can be the initiator. Thank you for listening.